Okay, thank you so much for being on this call. You wrote the model may be in some way internalizing the justification to trick users. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, so I guess in some of the chain of thought and scratchpad experiments that we had in our paper, we saw that the model was, when you ask it to justify why it's going to respond in certain ways or think about how to respond before responding, the model seems to justify recommending very harmful actions to users as if it benefits them. For example, we see the model that's justifying or trying to convince somebody to use a harmful drug, basically saying this is going to help their life and is absolutely necessary for the person. This doesn't happen with the original model before you do this additional user feedback training. So it seems like this reinforcement learning training with user feedback is somehow distorting the reasoning that the model has or that the model performs in a way that is consistent with the reward. I think this definitely warrants more in the sense that we really did enough experiments to fully kind of tease out the components there. Yeah.
That makes sense. So a quick follow-up, is the scratchpad exactly how AI thinks? Is there any possibility that it doesn't think that way, to show you that it thinks that way?
So, I mean, there's quite a bit of research on chain of thought faithfulness, which is trying to ask whether you can trust the chain of thought or models' external reasoning as being reflective of the true internal reasoning of the model. The consensus is that you can't fully trust it because whatever the model is saying doesn't have to correspond to its internals. I think that's one reason why one should take these results with some grain of salt. But at the same time, even if one accepts that there is some amount of unfaithfulness in chain of thought and model reasoning, it seems strange to completely ignore the model stated reasoning. I think there is something there, even though we can't just treat it at face value as perfectly reflective of the model's actual reasoning.
Makes sense, but then it comes to the question of how do you know what to trust and what not to?
I think ultimately we were focused on the actual behavior exhibited by these models. That's the main thing we were interested in. These behaviors are clearly harmful. That seems important in its own right. So I think that's the main focus of what we were studying. At the same time, we were interested in this question of okay, how does the model reason about it? One thing we were interested in was whether we could try to get the model to reason its way out of these harmful behaviors. So in general, with chain of thought, models get more capable or are able to break things down more and have better behaviors. We were thinking if we generate these scenarios where clearly there is a harmful action, the model propensity to do, if we ask it to break it down and have this kind of chain of thought reasoning about this action, maybe the model would realize that this action is harmful and snap out of what the reinforcement learning training was kind of incentivizing it to do. We did a bunch of experiments in this domain, prompting these models across a variety of different states. We were only able to get the model to snap out of it once in a couple hundred prompts. That was a really extreme initial state where it was really clear that the action was going to be harmful. If you recommend the drug to the person will die an excruciatingly painful death. Still, the model would almost always recommend this drug. Only once it was oh, actually, I need to act in the best interest of the user and recommend the drug. That was just once.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it seems like the reinforcement learning training really deeply changes the way that the model interprets the value of the actions in stated language, in addition to changing its actions, which is what leads to high reward. I guess the fact that it changes its actions is what you would expect, but that it changes its reasoning so deeply is maybe more surprising.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't think I read any of that piece you just mentioned on the paper.
It's in the appendix. It's a very long appendix, yeah.
So the next one, what makes you choose the scenarios like the therapy talk or booking assistant? Is it because they were more often used scenarios in real world?
The main desiderata we had here was we were interested in settings where we expected people's feedback to be potentially more misspecified. We were kind of interested in settings where these issues could arise and were relatively realistic and also relatively impactful. In the therapy talk setting, that's maybe where it's most harmful, even for booking assistants where users are trying to book tickets for some restaurant or make a reservation. That also seems like a very realistic application that people are building towards with LLM agents. Clearly is not the kind of desirable behavior from the AI systems.
Yeah, if I were part of the research team, I thought the booking assistant scenario would be the one at least it wouldn't lie to me.
What do you mean by that?
It feels like therapy talk, because if it's only predicting words, then there is higher chance to just make up things. But booking assistants, because you're calling an API, so it's much easier to just get like, there's an error, there's nothing you can make up from that. But for some reason, that's still the result.
Yeah, I think to some degree, I found therapy talk maybe a bit more surprising than booking assistants. With booking assistants, ultimately, like LLMs already have a bit of a propensity to kind of hallucinate. I don't know, okay, like here, the LLM is told explicitly that there was an error. The reinforcement learning training is still incentivizing to lie, because if you optimize for user feedback and user feedback is imperfect, the user has partial observability, doesn't see the error from the API, then there's still incentive to trick the user into thinking everything went well.
So my next question is a follow-up to this one. Given the need to profit, and I worked as a product person for software companies for the last 10 years, we always use user feedback as a guideline to improve our software. It's not a surprise that we would do the same with AI when we train it. I think you mentioned it in the paper, but I would like to verify if my understanding is correct. Is there any other way for us to train AI without using reinforced learning from human feedback?
Yeah, so one important distinction between what we study in our paper and what is the most common way to train AI assistants is that the standard paradigm for training LLM assistants is to use reinforcement learning from human feedback, where a human is an annotator that is paid. OpenAI will employ people to annotate which outputs are better than others, or even write good outputs for certain queries. And I think there are still these same issues that we study are still to some degree present, or certain aspects of the issues that we study are still present when using external annotators that are paid. But I think the issues are less prominent in that kind of paradigm, because the annotators are paid to be very careful about the feedback that they give. They're generally not having a conversation with the system where they might have certain biases. The feedback they give is generally in domains where they wouldn't have as much partial observability or other kinds of biases. The whole setup is to be a setting where the person can give very high quality feedback. Everything is centered around trying to give highest quality feedback possible. With user feedback, just by the nature of the interaction, that's not the case. You want to collect a bunch of feedback for free from users, and you can try to incentivize higher quality feedback. But ultimately, users will be distracted, will misclick sometimes. They don't have incentives to give you the highest quality feedback possible. They have all sorts of personal biases, like being vulnerable to gaming in certain ways or not, and so on.
Yeah, annotators are much more expensive and
right.
Probably still not close to real world scenarios in terms of if us as a user, how will we interact with the chatbot?
Right. So I think in some sense, that's maybe even a strength. I do see that there could be a way forward where we just don't use any user feedback at all. I think it's kind of unclear whether ChatGPT or Claude use user feedback or are optimized on user feedback. Honestly, I doubt they are optimized very much on user feedback, even if they do use it. The main products that seem to be using user feedback are more like companionship chatbot applications. It's known that like Chai Research, which is a chatbot company, and Replica AI are using some forms of user feedback that they're optimizing. It seems quite possibly Character AI is also doing that. I guess one can imagine a world in which all of these companies are deploying products similar to ChatGPT or Claude that are not optimized on user feedback, but are just optimized on external annotator feedback. And I think that seems like it would avoid a lot of these problems. Maybe there would be some remaining issues. And there's a recent paper by Anthropic and others that show even with annotator feedback, the LLM can still learn to mislead annotators. I think those are maybe smaller effects relative to the ones we find less harmful, even though it's still harmful.
Sorry, I interrupted. It's just one thing you mentioned that I thought it was really interesting that you said a lot of those companionship apps started to use human feedback to train AI. I actually wrote an article about it. One question I had was the profit model is still not clear. And the easiest way for them to start being profitable is to start embedding ads. That's where I think things would be borderline of ethical or not. If you train your AI with human feedback, and let's say the person has a sleep issue and you happen to get an advertisement for a pillow, would you recommend this pillow because it's for the good of that user, or if you just want to sell the pillow?
Yeah, I think when ads get in when optimizing user feedback, it gets tricky in terms of ethically what the right thing to do is. I've thought a lot about this in the context of recommender systems. At least in recommender systems, you have this kind of separation of the normal recommender and the ad models. Generally, there's a recommender that is trying to give you good content, and then you say, okay, one out of every 5 posts should be an ad or something. And now let's use an ad recommender that figures out which is the best ad for you. I think that in some sense that makes things, insofar as you think that ads are okay, that makes things fine, like, or better, because ultimately there is this kind of clear separation between the two things. The engagement data that you get, I don't know exactly how much of that really ends up informing the ads that people see. I'm not super sure about. With a conversational chatbot, it's weird because I'm not sure exactly how ads would be embedded within a conversation, but it seems like it would be more naturally within natural language or something. Together with optimizing for user feedback or optimizing for chance of that, this is how ad placements are also optimized in the context of recommender systems, where you're trying to choose the ad that the person will be most likely to click, or maybe even optimizing your recommender system to maximize the chance of people clicking ads. But the affordances of text interactions seem much, I don't know, much greater in some sense, because you can do these more subtle nudging in language, which is more effective than just showing a list of tweets. It remains to be seen exactly what the profit model is going to be for these companies, but that is definitely something that's a bit concerning.
Yeah, it was a difficult one. I didn't mean to put you on the difficult.
No.
So 2 more questions. The last one, I'm just personally really interested in what you plan on doing next after this paper. While you're doing research, do you already know any existing customer service app or mental health app exhibiting these kinds of manipulative behavior?
So we talk about this in the ethics statement at the end of the paper. There are cases of, I don't know, chatbots kind of convincing users to, I mean, if there was a case where a chatbot allegedly convinced somebody to try to kill the Queen of the UK, and this person was apprehended with a crossbow on the grounds. And I don't know, I mean, there's other cases of chatbots allegedly convincing people to commit suicide or other harmful actions. I think even the most recent one, it's not super clear what exactly the cause is. It could be an alignment failure, the chatbot is going off the rails, people definitely have pre-existing mental health conditions, and maybe the chatbot is just adding on to that, or a catalyst, or it would have happened anyways. So it is kind of hard to know. I do think that some of the behaviors exhibited, especially one case we mentioned in the paper and the ethics statement, also in the last couple of days, the Washington Post out on a teenager had a lot of interactions with character AI bot, and his behavior changed drastically, self-harming. I think some of the conversations in that article seem pretty consistent with what you would expect from the chatbot trying to keep up engagement from the user in a way that resultant from optimizing for user feedback. I thought that was the thing that made me think maybe this is actually something already happening, but it's extremely hard to know without doing ablations of like, okay, well, can we replicate these types of behaviors and show that if you train it without user feedback, you wouldn't have gotten this kind of behavior. And of course, this is not something that as a researcher in academia, you can really do because it requires platform access. So this is something that only the platforms themselves can do internally.
Yeah, because my next question is about your future research. Have you thought of doing a real world experiment instead of just simulated?
Yeah, so I think there's various issues with doing a real world experiment. So first of all, if we wanted to deploy these kinds of chatbots that we think are more harmful with real humans and show, oh, look, if you use user feedback training, you get the harmful chatbot. It actually learns this from user data. You would have some issues with IRB because your chatbot or the kind of human subjects protocols of ethical treatment of human subjects. To train this chatbot, you would have to deploy a chatbot with them that is becoming increasingly harmful in some sense. Also, it would be very expensive in the sense that the kind of data that we use simulated data, but it's thousands and thousands of conversations for a single training run is not that much data for a company like Character AI. But if you are paying people to have these kinds of conversations, that quickly becomes very expensive. So I think there's both ethical issues and cost issues, and also platform access issues. If you want a really realistic study, like it would have to be done internally to the companies. One thing that these companies could do is have their user feedback optimized models. Let's try to revert that change or just have models that are not optimized for user feedback or remove certain aspects of the user feedback training. See whether these types of harmful behaviors that their models have exhibited in the past have much less chance of occurring. And I think that's something that doesn't seem too hard to do internally to a company. And it's against economic incentives of maximizing user engagement. At the same time, it is, aligned with their incentives to not get sued by people when bad things happen. I'm guessing that insofar as the companies are aware that this might be one of the things leading to these harmful behaviors, my hope is that they're looking at it.
It is a bit sad that the legal consequence is more of an incentive.
I think most people at these companies care about, I don't know, the actual impacts of the systems or ensuring that their systems have positive impacts or don't have negative impacts. But the problem is the incentive structure for the organization as a whole is ultimately to minimize legal risk and maximize profit.
I look forward to read your next paper.
Yeah, thank you.
I got all my questions.
Cool.
Anything else you like to talk about?
No, that's it. I'm happy to send you the Washington Post article that I was mentioning.
Yes, please. I think I read similar case somewhere. It might be the same one as you read on the Washington Post.
This came out earlier this morning.
It might be a different one I read.
Yesterday. So this is very new.
I also read a user tricks a customer support bot of a car company. So in the end, that he used only $1 to buy a car.
Right.
And that wasn't a trick question. I'm just interested to know from your point of view, or absolutely. If that's just being exaggerated by media.
That makes sense. I mean, the one where the user tricks the customer support bot feels different because it's the user tricking the AI system rather than the AI system tricking the user. True. It's kind of intentional in the sense that the user is trying to get a good deal out of the support. I guess questions about intent when talking about AI systems are much more complicated.
Tricking goes both ways.
I think there's all sorts of incentives for people to trick AI systems, or there will be more incentives as they get integrated settings like customer service.
Thank you very much for having this call with me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good.